So I will introduce our next speaker, Professor Jennifer Jackson from Caltech. So her talk is about integrative deep earth science through advances in X-ray spectroscopy. Hi, Jennifer, please take from here.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the organizers of this very nice workshop and all the speakers so far. It's really been a stimulating last couple days, and I'm excited to be presenting some of our recent research here. And the title slide sort of highlights the interdisciplinary approaches that we take to understanding Earth and planetary processes in a synergistic way. And also, what I'll highlight in over the next 25 minutes or so is our multi-technique approach. But first, I'd like to just highlight that this image that's shown here is generated from a geodynamic model that's informed by plate history, and that's shown on the surface here using G plates. And there's also an example where a thermochemical layer has been implemented at the core mantle boundary, and the blue regions, show cold downwellings, and the red regions are, of course, the warm upwelling regions. And so we'll focus on a couple of these areas, the core mantle boundary and the core during the next half hour or so. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the next. I'd like to acknowledge my current group members and as well as former group members. The current group is shown here, and as well as our funding sources, National Science Foundation, in particular the CSETI program. And the work that I'm going to be showing today is mostly the work of, I'm going to show an example of the work that Olivia Pardoe is doing together with a summer research student, part of the Caltech WAVE Fellow Program, Nina Gelkeson. She's a rising senior in physics at Mount Holyoke College, Vasilie Dobrosavievich, and Barbara Rochbacher, who's now an assistant professor at UC Davis. So also importantly, I really would like to express our appreciation to all of our collaborators and colleagues at the national facilities that have made these experiments possible. Before COVID, we were fortunate to conduct experiments at GSE CARS just before the lockdown, shown here, and some of those results are being presented today. And during COVID, with help from Sector 3, the ALS and NSLS2, we were able to conduct measurements, and we are extremely grateful for this. Okay, so before we get into the core mantle boundary and the core, the two topics that I'll focus most of the discussion on, I do want to highlight some of the recent work that we've been doing together with collaborators at compressed supported facilities. This is work conducted by Olivia Pardoe, and the application is to understanding icy satellites, surfaces, and their interiors. The Galileo mission pointed out that through their observations, the NIM spectrometer and laboratory measurements, is that the surfaces contain hydrated sulfates, and it's still not understood whether or not they're exogenic in origin or endogenic in origin, or a combination of both. And she discovered two phase transitions. Actually, this gamma phase hadn't been discovered before. And this was complemented by synchrotron infrared spectroscopy with Zhenxian Liu. And currently, we're now working on doing measurements at high pressures and cryogenic temperatures, also enabled by collaboration with Zhenxian Liu. So another effort that we've been focusing on over the last few years is understanding, collaborating with geology professor Claire Buchholz. She recently joined the Caltech faculty, and together with, at the time, postdoc Barbara Rochbacher, are interested in using a multi-technique approach to understanding the post-crystallization processes, in particular through analysis of calcic volcanic amphiboles. And this is really made possible using a new spectrometer for Moosbauer spectroscopy that has been designed and developed by Tom Tollner. The spectrometer sits at 3 IDD at the APS, and it takes advantage of the hybrid mode, beam time. There's a pulse selector and a pulse suppressor. And so this allows Moosbauer measurements using essentially the full EV beam and data collection times that are reduced significantly from, let's say, laboratory measurements or normal sort of operations of conducting synchrotron Moosbauer spectroscopy, let's say during 24 bunch mode. And it also allows the capability of conducting energy domain Moosbauer spectroscopy. So it uses a Moosbauer drive and uses a stainless steel foil, and that is essentially the source. And this is also quite a nice way to complement and to facilitate measurements that wouldn't otherwise be possible in the laboratory, because we're interested in spatially resolving the ferric iron content of these amphiboles and correlating it with actually at the same exact sample position, the water content and the deuterium content. And so finally, before we go down to the core mantle boundary, one thing that we've been able to do is utilize synchrotron Moosbauer spectroscopy to go beyond determining valence and spin states to actually extract the force constants of iron at simultaneous high pressure and high temperature conditions. And this is work led by Dongxiao Zhang. And it's also been validated by high pressure, high temperature NRIX measurements, and also measurements using NRIX at room pressure. And so from these measurements, we see that the force constants are affected by temperature. And if one wants to estimate a equilibrium isotope fractionation of iron from this new knowledge, it's about a 0.1 per mil effect lower compared to using room temperature NRIX measurements and extrapolating using this harmonic approximation. So this is an observation we made utilizing synchrotron Moosbauer spectroscopy in sort of a different way. And so now we're going to dive down into the core mantle boundary. This is motivated, we've seen this expressed from other speakers at this workshop, motivated through seismic observations, and in particular regional seismic observations, because we're going to be looking at ultra low velocity zones, which are relatively small scale and really require doing regional seismology. This is just the Northridge event that shows the sections at various and arrivals at various different stations. And I also wanted to mention that this seismology is not, it's not always possible to deploy seismometers on the surface of planets. Long-term deployments are sometimes hindered by the pressures and more importantly, the temperatures of the surface. And so this sort of motivated me to develop collaborations with JPL and develop detection of seismic sources using their infrasound signal. And so we're able to demonstrate the first earthquake detection, natural earthquake detection from an aerial platform with applications for eventually deploying such a balloon-based mission to Venus. Okay, so the two examples that I'd like to concentrate on for the rest of the talk today, our ultra low velocity zones, and then go into the core. And so first, and foremost, the map that's shown on your left-hand side shows a compilation by you and Garnero. This was in 2018. There's an updated map of the distribution of ultra-low velocity zones by Thorne et al. And Hansen et al. And it really highlights the various, say, I'd say the nature of the seismic signatures that they've evaluated in terms of understanding how likely or how robust the detection is and non-detection areas, so where seismologists have looked, but they didn't see any evidence for ultra-low velocity zones, or the seismic signature was complex enough to pose questions about whether or not there is an ultra-low velocity zone present there. And understanding the ultra-low velocity zones, their distribution, their composition, really helps to understand Earth's history, because it's, these ultra-low velocity zones could have been present since crystallization of Earth's from a magma ocean, or it could be reactions from the outer core, could be partial melting. And it could be a range of these interpretations that all help us understand what is happening at the core mantle boundary, how heat is being transferred across this boundary, and potentially what can it say about Earth's history and the crystallization process. So these patches have been really, one of the first observations was done by my dear friend and colleague, the late Don Helmberger, with at the time a student at Garnero, looking at SPDKS and the move out of this phase, and suggesting that this behavior has been slowed down by 10 to 30% at the core mantle boundary. And so throughout the last several decades, many observations suggest they're slow in VP and VS, not always analyzed at the same location due to geometry of stations and sources. And this leads to a variable VP to VS ratio. And some studies have used PCP or SCP to try to constrain the density of these, although this is still difficult to constrain. And so these observations, especially the strong drop, potential for iron-rich phases to crystallize out of a magma ocean, inspired the hypothesis that these ultra-low velocity zones could contain iron-rich MgFeO or magnesiorustite. And so we also looked into partitioning information that has been published so far, and it really shows that under these conditions of the lowermost mantle, that iron does prefer to be in the oxide over the silicate, and quite strongly favors the possibility that there could exist an iron-rich MgFeO, and it could be stable. And so experiments that were done initially to test this hypothesis were done by June Wicks through her PhD thesis at Caltech, working together with Dan Bauer, who's a geodynamicist, and showed from polycrystalline data using NRIX, using the NRIX method, that the shear, in particular the shear waves, but also determined the P waves through equation of state measurements, that they're significantly depressed with respect to Prem. So we see here the pressure wave is significantly slower compared to 1D Earth model. The shear wave significantly slower than the 1D Earth model. And combined with geodynamic simulations, a lot of the observations that had been made in the past could fit, in particular, the height and the topography could, let's say, be explained by the presence of magnesiorustite. But how much? And can we get more quantitative about this? So this has also motivated the study of single crystals of magnesiorustite. So this is enabled by the high energy resolution inelastic X-ray scattering beamline at sector 30 IDC. We're able to conduct very beautiful measurements to constrain the dispersion relation of the acoustic phonons, both P and S waves of this magnesiorustite single crystal. This is led by, at the time, postdoc Greg Finkelstein, and compared with ultrasonic results, found very good agreement. But what we found with increasing pressure, which was really quite exciting and surprising, is the extreme level of anisotropy, or the extreme magnitude of anisotropy. So see the P waves appear at the top, the S waves by almost 60% anisotropy, in particular the 100 direction. And so using this information, we explored this possibility in a chapter that I recently published with Tina Thomas, an AGU chapter on the D double prime layer. Going into some of the details of how one could get a little bit more quantitative about this interpretation is working together with Don Helmberger and graduate student Vun Lai and Vasily Dobrosavievich. We did look at this region underneath Hawaii and performed an inversion using the mineral phase proportions and their elastic properties, the seismic observations, and their relative uncertainties to compute the elastic properties of the phase assemblages and invert for what proportion of this iron-rich magnesiorustite could be responsible or could explain the seismic observations, which have a very slow, they point to a very slow basal layer and a relatively, well, still slow, but relatively, let's say not, I would say just a low velocity region near the top. And it's showing this, this figure shows that the proportion of these phases, be it for magnesiorustite or any other, let's say, region in the earth, if one is doing this inversion, that it depends, of course, on how these grains, how the strain is essentially partitioned from amongst these grains. So whether, you know, what we show is a Voigt bound and a Royce bound, but you can see that the actual proportion, the final, let's say, constraint, comes from understanding how strain is partitioned into these phases, which I know is an ongoing problem to be understood and solved. And so certainly more understanding in that area would lead to tighter constraints of not just this area of the earth, the core mantle boundary or D double prime, but other areas in the earth. Okay, so moving on to the final part, essentially we've talked about the core mantle boundary and the potential for iron-rich MgFeO to explain some ultra-low velocity zones, in particular those with a 2-to-1 ratio or even a 3-to-1 ratio, where the shear waves are reduced by up to 3 compared to the P waves. So this can be explained by the elastic properties of magnesiorustite with anywhere from 10 to 30 volume percent in that assemblage. But in order to, I would say, going beyond this uncertainty in the rheological properties of this phase assemblage and how strain is partitioning, but understanding or constraining the phase relations in this thermal boundary layer really is controlled by, of course, Earth's history, what has precipitated, if anything has precipitated in the early stages of Earth's history, and the current temperature profile in the lowermost mantle and the core. So on the mantle side, of course, it's determined by plausible mantle geotherms anchored by major phase transitions. On the core side, constrained by temperature at the inner core boundary, the light element effects on the melting points, and the thermal profile in the outer core. So this motivated us to better constrain the thermal elasticity of iron, plausible light elements, and the melting of iron alloys. So one example I'd like to show in terms of using one of the compressed facilities, Sector 3 IDB, and the nuclear resonant inelastic X-ray scattering technique is to go beyond that of sound velocities, but to use the entire measured spectrum. And for iron, this entire measured spectrum and determining the unit cell volume dependence of that allows one to determine and constrain the vibrational thermodynamic properties, such as the Gruneisen parameter, thermal expansion, and thermal pressure. So other speakers have brought this point up during this workshop, the importance of understanding thermal pressure, not just from a material specific property, which is what we've done for iron and iron alloys, but to also measure this quantity in situ. So this will come up in just a couple minutes. And we do see, of course, that thermal pressure is very high from the vibrational component. This is not the electronic component, but the vibrational component can be upwards of 40 to 60 GPa, depending on the temperature. This was also mentioned by Quentin Williams a couple days ago. And so this consideration is necessary for pinpointing where one is making a comparison, for example, of sound velocities and modeling them at Earth's interior conditions and comparing those with seismic observations. Is it what pressure is one doing those comparisons at? And so to that effect, we did investigate the effects of nickel and the effects of silicon. And through work with determining the equation of state up to about 160, 170 gigapascals at GSE cars using a helium pressure medium and a tungsten gauge pressure gauge, we were able to combine those thermoelastic properties when measured using NRIX and the equation of state information and constraints to project these properties to the inner core conditions. And of course, what one sees markedly is the slopes for the bulk modulus and bulk sound velocity are significantly different. This is something that still needs to be understood. But if we look at just the inner core boundary, we see that depending on the temperature, that it could have, let's say on the low end, there's a tighter constraint. If we just consider nickel and silicon, we see this overlap here. But at higher temperatures, let's say assuming a temperature of 6,000 Kelvin, there's quite a range of nickel and silicon contents that can explain, say, AK-135, which is one of the models for Earth's, one of the 1D models for Earth's core. So this, of course, motivates the next and last section of my talk is to develop a multi-technique approach to measuring and constraining the melting points of iron alloys. In this example, I'm going to look at the effect of silicon and nickel. And this is work by Vasily Dobrosavljevic. And this combines two techniques, synchrotron Moosbauer spectroscopy, which is a technique that I've been developing with colleagues at Sector 3 at the APS, which probes the dynamics of the iron 57 containing atom in the sample, and synchrotron X-ray diffraction. So these probe two different time and length scales. And so in this example, we show the synchrotron Nussbauer time spectrum, which constrains the thickness of the sample, which is important, and the integrated time delay as a function of temperature. So the important thing to mention is that the determination of the melting point is using experimental specific properties. So we use a physical model to describe the scattering process as well as a measured X-ray focus size, and that's incorporated in the FIT, the data. We also use the same, the sample from the same, it's cut from the same aliquot and the same loading conditions. So in this movie, I like to show is the, let's see, let me just get this. So this is a movie we put together showing the evolution of the X-ray diffraction patterns. And what we've done here is use the automated burst heating mode at GSE cars, which allows us to have access to the background level of each pair of hot spectrum. And so what I'll show in the next slide is that using this technique allows for the detection of small amounts of melt, as opposed to having, say, a very difficult time detecting a change in the background if one is not using the burst heating mode. There's a lot of scatter. And so what we use is pairs of these patterns. And there, you also see recrystallization in these videos here. And so finally, in the next couple slides, will show that the evolution of the hot spectra is shown here on the left, and the pairs of cold spectra, you see the changes to reference in the background shape can make it very difficult to detect small levels of melts. And you see the scatter on the right. However, by using pairs of these X-ray diffraction patterns, we can now see a clear deviation from just a general heating trend. And this is what we use to detect melting. We also use in situ pressure measurements of the sample and KCl. And this leads to a very good agreement and reproducibility on the agreement of melting. So here shows all the melting runs and the FCC to HCP boundary. And I will conclude with showing the phase diagram, and it shows my thoughts for the future of APS and considering the APS upgrade is that this approach can be applied to other phase assemblages. It also helps constrain sample thickness, which is required for transport property measurements, and this can easily be developed for the APSU. Okay, thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So we have time for one quick question. You have a question from Alex.
Yes, good. Nice talk. Can you explain me how did you determine thermal pressure from your XRD data?
Yes. So what we did was we measured the unit cell volumes of the sample and of KCl. The sample as equation of state was determined, it's the same sample that was determined in the Morrison et al. Paper and the thermal properties. We use that equation of state to determine the pressure of the sample. We use the equation of state of KCl to determine the pressure at the pressure medium. This shows, so what you see on the right is the very good agreement between those pressures. And what we do is we take the average of those two pressures, and those are the pressures that we report for the melting points.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a quick question about so the setup at 3IDD. Mm-hmm. So is it similar to what ESR, like ESIF is doing?
No, it's different. So it doesn't utilize an iron borate crystal. The iron borate crystal is, needs to be cooled. This utilizes the high-speed shutter, so it utilizes an EV beam, It selects out the pulse from the hybrid mode, and it illuminates the stainless steel foil, which acts as the source. So the iron 57 and the stainless steel foil acts as the source. That's on a drive, and then one can do is conventional Doppler shifted spectroscopy.
Thank you very much, Jenny.